Good morning, friends.
Good morning.
It has been an incredible journey engaging in the rich and thought-provoking conversations here at CWM There 2025. As we gather on this final day, we are privileged to hear from our second keynote speaker, someone whose work and presence continue to inspire and challenge us. It is my honor and privilege to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Sarojini Nadar, who holds the Desmond Tutu Research Chair in Religion and Social Justice at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa, a leading feminist scholar of religion, both nationally and internationally. Professor Nadar has dedicated her career to addressing gender-based violence in its many forms, physical, sexual, and epistemic. Her work is deeply transdisciplinary, creating spaces for researchers and postgraduate students to engage with critical issues at the intersections of religion and social justice. Through her leadership, her research spans questions of race, class, gender, and sexuality, always with a commitment to justice and transformation. Professor Nadar is no stranger to the DARE Global Fora. She was a key part of the International Steering Group for DARE 2023, where she co-convened the Slaveries and Discipleship stream alongside Dr. Anna Perkins. Professor Nadar's forthcoming book, Gender, Genocide, Gaza, Rereading the Book of Esther as a Text of Terrorism, is under contract with Routledge and promises to be a powerful and timely contribution to liberation theology and feminist biblical studies. Today, she will deliver a keynote address titled Beyond Neutrality, an Epistemological Preference for Palestine. Friends, please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Dr. Sarojini Nadar.
Good morning, friends.
Good morning.
Sorry. I was saying that I'm a river of menopausal tears this morning, so please forgive me. Yeah. I am deeply grateful for the invitation by CWM to share some reflections with you today. Over the past few days, each time I met one of you for the first time, whether in a session or over lunch or in the elevator, you said with great anticipation and wide eyes, "We are looking forward to your keynote." And boy, have I felt the weight of that expectation. Hashtag no pressure. But let me say this at the outset, both to steady my own nerves and to make an important point. A keynote is never the most important voice in the room. It is simply one voice, amplified for a moment, okay, maybe in my case for an hour, though I'll try to keep it shorter. A keynote voice can only carry the echoes of many others. Therefore, I do not stand before you as an authority or an expert speaking from above, but as one shaped by those who came before me and those who walk alongside me. It is in our collective discernment and our combined radical engagement that true liberation becomes possible. When I first proposed this paper and submitted its title and abstract months ago, the genocide in Gaza was already happening for almost a year, and I was in the midst of completing my book with the short title, Gender, Genocide, Gaza, as you've just heard. Today, a fragile ceasefire may offer some moments of relief, but it does not erase the brutal reality of what has transpired for over a year, nor does it diminish the urgency of the call for freedom. Because from the river to the sea, Palestine is still not free. The occupation remains, apartheid persists, and the work of liberation theologians is far from finished. If anything, this moment demands renewed reflection on how we, as theologians committed to liberation, define not just the content of our liberation theologies, but the frameworks, the lenses, the epistemologies, and the methodologies of our theologies. And these are the concerns that my paper today focuses on. The main thesis of my paper is this: theological neutrality in the face of oppression functions as complicity. And so I begin with the words of the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and these words will ground my paper throughout. In a situation of injustice and oppression, there can be no neutrality. You have to take sides. You have to say, am I on the side of justice or am I on the side of injustice? When an elephant is sitting on the tail of a mouse and you say, I am neutral, the mouse is not going to be particularly pleased about your neutrality. You have already made a decision. You have decided to be on the side of the powerful, of the elephant. There is no neutrality. You have already, in fact, made a choice. These words, spoken in 1986 at Stanford University in the US, were part of Tutu's call for American solidarity against apartheid in South Africa. But these words have been at the forefront of my thoughts since October 7th, 2023. As I watched in when theologians, even and especially those committed to liberation, hesitated, sat on the fence, retreated into rhetorical neutrality, and employed the language of both sides to discuss a situation in which power is actually not present on both sides. It is radically asymmetrical. This is not a failure of knowledge on the part of these theologians. No, it is a failure of moral courage. The late Archbishop was unambiguous and uncompromising. This is apartheid, he declared, on encountering the occupation firsthand. This declaration was not a rhetorical flourish, but a recognition shaped by his own experiences of racism, segregation, and state violence in apartheid South Africa. I too, as a South African born in 1976, a critical year in the struggle against apartheid, and as a descendant of Indian indentured laborers subjected to slavery conditions, recognize in Palestine the same systems of control and dehumanization that shape South Africa's history. Like Tutu, I recognize that justice demands solidarity, not an abstract, generalized concern for peace, but a concrete commitment to the liberation of the oppressed. For as Martin Luther King Jr. said, peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of justice. So my paper today will unfold in 3 parts. In the first part, I will make the case for why we, as global theologians committed to liberation, must adopt an epistemological preference for Palestine. Just as liberation theology calls us to have a preferential option for the poor, recognizing that those who suffer injustice firsthand have unique knowledge about the forces that oppress them, so too must we advance what I call a preferential option for Palestinians. The second part of my paper is called If Words Could Kill, because the way we frame our theological discourses matter. Language is never neutral. It shapes reality. It defines whose suffering is recognized and whose lives are deemed worthy of mourning. Here, I will use critical discourse analysis, which is a method that examines how language constructs, reinforces, and challenges power dynamics, to examine 3 key texts that claim to address the situation in Gaza. The first text is a call for papers issued by the International Journal of Public Theology, which frames the genocide in Gaza in ways that obscure structural injustice. The second is a statement issued by the Global Network of Public Theologians, which, while attempting to acknowledge Palestinian suffering, ultimately reinforces a false equivalency between the oppressed and the oppressor. And the third is a statement posted by Marion Budd, the Episcopal Bishop, do you say Budd or Buddy? Buddy. Marion Buddy, the Episcopal Bishop of Washington, who became famous or infamous for publicly rebuking Donald Trump most recently. For those of you who don't know or have been living under a rock, she gained widespread recognition and the label nasty for courageously calling out Donald Trump in a national prayer service in Washington just before his presidential inauguration. But, as I will argue, her response to Gaza exposes the limits of a liberation theology that is not truly intersectional. Through this analysis, I will show how together these 3 theological statements, despite their attempts at balance, rely on language that minimizes or erases Palestinian suffering while upholding dominant power structures. If words could kill, and they do, then how we use them in theology matters profoundly. In the final part of my paper, I will propose a roadmap for a global theology of Palestinian solidarity. Here I will draw on intersectional Black theology and a conceptual framework proposed by myself and my colleague Demaine Solomons that centers around constructs of existence, resistance, and solidarity, to outline a theological model that moves beyond lament, and more importantly, one that also can self-introspect. So, how do we come to an understanding of an epistemological preference for Palestinians? The epistemological privilege of the oppressed refers to the idea that those who experience systemic oppression have unique insights into injustice, making their perspective essential for uncovering and challenging structures of domination. This epistemological privileging emerges from the core principle of liberation theology, that is, God sides with the oppressed. It aligns with James Cone's assertion that there can be no Christian theology that is not identified unreservedly with those who are humiliated and abused. In fact, theology ceases to be a theology of the gospel when it fails to arise out of the community of the oppressed. Desmond Tutu embodied this principle, extending his commitment to justice beyond apartheid South Africa to apartheid Israel. This is also the core of Gustavo Guterres's articulation of the preferential option for the poor, a theological commitment that does not sentimentalize suffering, but insists that systemic injustice is neither inevitable nor morally neutral. Guterres reminds us, the poor person does not exist as an inescapable fact of destiny. His or her existence is not politically neutral, and it is not ethically innocent. The poor are a byproduct of the system in which we live and for which we are responsible. Hence, the poverty of the poor is not a call to generous relief action, but a demand that we go and build a different social order. I argue that liberation theology, in its call for radical social transformation, necessarily and logically extends its reasoning to Palestine. Palestinians who have endured decades of displacement, occupation, apartheid, and now genocide embody precisely the conditions that liberation theology seeks to address. Mitri Raheb, a leading Palestinian liberation theologian and no stranger to DARE, articulates this reality. He says, occupied people are not poor per se, but they are made poor. Their resources are exploited by the empire, and they are cheap labor to keep the economy of the empire running and growing. The cost of the Israeli occupation of Palestinian land is around $10 billion annually, representing almost 80% of the GDP. The total economic aid that we get, he says, doesn't even compensate for 10% of what the occupation is costing us. Occupied people are not poor. They are made poor. Jesus understood that. This is why he is not promising them aid, but good news of social justice. The God of the oppressed in Black theology also offers another crucial lens for understanding the Palestinian struggle. James Cone argued that God's presence is revealed in the resistance of the oppressed, and in the same way, he identified the crucifixion of Jesus as an act of state-sanctioned violence against a marginalized body. Palestinian liberation theologians highlight the parallels between Jesus' suffering and the ongoing brutalization of Palestinians. In sum, then, an epistemological preference for Palestinians integrates Guterres's preferential option for the poor with Cone's God of the oppressed. Such an epistemological preference directly counters what Mitri Raheb has called the theological software that sustains the occupation. These frameworks converge on the same core truth, that God is revealed in the struggles of the oppressed, and that theology must not only name injustice, but must actively resist it. I now move on to the second part of the paper, where I will explore 3 selected texts to illustrate how words can kill. As I said, the first text is a call for papers by the International Journal of Public Theology on the situation in Palestine. On 26 April 2024, over 6 months into the ongoing genocide in Gaza, the International Journal of Public Theology issued a call for papers that read as follows. The International Journal of Public Theology dedicates a thematic issue to the public theological dimensions of the ongoing conflict in Israel/Palestine, as it has entered a new phase since the Hamas attacks of 7 October and the subsequent counterattacks of the Israeli Defense Forces. Contributions are invited that analyze and reflect on the theological dimensions of the conflict and the role of theology and theological motifs in the public sphere in as far as the conflict is discussed in this domain. Unquote. The CFP, the call for papers, poses several significant challenges when read through the lens of the epistemic privileging of the oppressed that liberation theology demands. Firstly, the neutral framing and theological silence on the occupation is the most glaring issue. Note the words in bold, if you can see it in bold. The CFP begins with the Hamas attack and then the subsequent Israeli counterattacks, suggesting a false moral equivalence between the two sides. Liberation theology critiques such neutrality as morally bankrupt, especially when one side, Israel, holds vastly disproportionate military, political, and economic power, backed by the West. This framing not only erases the decades-long violence of occupation and colonization of Palestinian lands, but also fails to acknowledge it as systemic oppression. by focusing solely on the recent phase of violence and its escalation, the CFP marginalizes the historical and ongoing reality of occupation, which, of course, we know is the root cause of Palestinian resistance. The selective moral outrage, coupled with the erasure of structural violence, minimizes the decades of oppression Palestinians have faced, including land dispossession, military occupation, and the denial of basic human rights. Liberation theology's insistence on a preferential option for the Palestinians would call for a clearer moral stance. The selective outrage reveals where the CFP's preferential option actually lies, namely with the dominant powers rather than the oppressed. An authentic liberation theology would categorically reject such false neutrality and demand that the starting point be the violence of occupation, not its escalation. Secondly, the CFP's repeated use of the term conflict rather than colonization or occupation is, quite frankly, a political misdirection. Liberation theologies in all its forms, Black, African, feminist, queer, etc., emphasize the power of naming. Using terms like colonization and occupation aligns theological discourse with the lived reality of oppression. In contrast, the neutral term conflict neutralizes and obfuscates this reality, suggesting that there is a symmetrical situation where both sides bear equal moral responsibility. This linguistic obfuscation is incompatible with the preferential option for the oppressed. If the Journal of Black Theology were to issue this call, its message would be quite different, I think. As Anthony Reddy reminds us, Black theology firmly rejects the idea that God is colorblind. Thirdly, the CFP risks positioning public theology as a complicit observer. By asking contributors to focus on the events of 7th October, the CFP situates public theology as a passive observer of surface-level events, rather than engaging the long-standing structural violence of the occupation. Liberation theology holds that resistance to oppression is itself a theological act, yet the CFP overlooks Palestinian resistance, reducing it to a single event, 7th October. Fourthly, the theological reflection in the CFP is concerningly detached from praxis. Its focus only on the theological dimensions of the recent conflict risks turning theology into a commentary on events rather than a force for transformation. Liberation theology's threefold method calls for seeing, judging, and acting. This CFP stops at seeing. Finally, the CFP erases Palestinian agency and resistance. By centering the theological discussion on Hamas attacks and Israeli counterattacks, the CFP strips Palestinians of their agency, presenting them as aggressors rather than liberation fighters. As South Africans, we are all too familiar with the strategy of calling freedom fighters terrorists. Even Desmond Tutu himself was labeled a terrorist. It was interesting how many times when I was drafting my book for publication recently, I was called upon over and over to make disclaimers about anti-Semitism, even before I could start describing what I wanted to do. It is the game that people play in moral equivocation. I found it exasperating to have to produce receipts of my condemnation of Hamas as a ticket to conversations about the horror of genocide. Arundhati Roy, in her acceptance speech of the Penn Pinter Prize last year, captures my frustrations perfectly. She says in her speech, "So this is the part in my speech where I'm expected to equivocate, to protect myself, my neutrality, my intellectual standing. This is the part where I'm meant to lapse into moral equivalence and condemn Hamas, the other militant groups in Gaza, and their ally Hezbollah in Lebanon for killing civilians and taking people hostage. Once that's done, it all becomes easy, doesn't it? Oh well, everybody's terrible. What can one do? Let's go shopping instead. I refuse to play the condemnation game, she says. Let me make myself clear. I do not tell oppressed people how to resist their oppression or who their allies should be. In sum, the call for papers by the IJPT, when viewed again through the lens of liberation theology, reveals deep theological and moral flaws. It fails to center the oppressed. It obscures the reality of colonization. It compels public theology to a place of passive observation. It detaches theology from praxis. And finally, it erases Palestinian agency and resistance, all of which run counter to the liberative demands of theology in context of systemic injustice. I move now from the IJPT's call for papers to the Global Network of Public Theology as my second example of theological neutrality. On October 29th, 2024, I received an email statement from the Global Network of Public Theology, which stated in part, and I quote, "During the last few weeks, the GNPT executive members had an extensive discussion on the situation in the war in Gaza. This was triggered by an open letter from 12 Palestinian Christian organizations. We, as the executive members, are fully aware of the sensitivity of the topic. And we ourselves do not all share the same view, but we felt it necessary to respond to the open letter from our fellow Christians and to express our deep concerns about the situation. Please note that since the GNPT does not represent each member institution, this statement is not meant to be an official GNPT statement to the public." Unquote. Although the GNPT's disclaimer states that this is not an official statement from the entire network, the fact that it is issued by the executive members, who are responsible for conducting the business of the network, lends it authority and relevance. As a statement endorsed by the leadership, it inevitably reflects the priorities and theological commitments shaping the GNPT's public witness. So let us have a look at the statement in more detail. It says, "The GNPT exists to promote theological contributions to public conversations in local contexts with global perspectives. We foster scholarly exchange about the contribution of Christianity to public discourse. On 20th October 2023, 12 Palestinian Christian organizations wrote an open letter to Western church leaders and theologians. In particular, they note that the Bible has been weaponized against Palestinians to justify their oppression, and they call upon church leaders and theologians to repent. The letter was written in the wake of Israel's bombardment of Gaza following the attacks by Hamas on Israel on 7th October. In response, we condemn the targeting of civilians by any party. We note that the present conflict is to be seen in the context of 75 years of illegal occupation and apartheid, in brackets, in accordance with the standards and definitions of the United Nations, and that Israel's retaliation has in the last year killed at least 42,000 Palestinians, mostly women and children, and injured a further 97,000 who are at risk of death by starvation, infection, and disease. The International Court of Justice has called the bombing of Gaza plausibly genocidal and condemns the increase in settler violence in the West Bank. The United Nations has called for an end of arms sales to Israel and for sanctions to be applied against Israel. As a global network of theologians, we stand against the use of theology to justify oppression, and we oppose both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. We call for justice and peace for all people of faith. I'm not going to read the rest of it. A year after Palestinian Christians' urgent call to action, the GNPT's delayed statement gestures toward occupation. So in that sense, it is a little bit better than the IJPT. But it still lacks the moral and theological clarity the crisis demanded. Its timing and language raise questions about public theology's commitment to liberation theology, especially the preferential option for the oppressed. I will offer 4 critical discursive critiques and observations to show how it falls short of the radical theological response needed in the face of genocide. Again, pay attention to the words in bold. Firstly, the statement references the language of the United Nations and the International Court of Justice, acknowledging the apartheid conditions, illegal settlements, and plausibly genocidal acts in Gaza. The GNPT's reliance on secular institutions diminishes its theological and moral power, sidestepping the liberation theological imperative to take an unambiguous stand with the oppressed. In fact, the secular institutions actually take a stronger stance than the GNPT, one could argue. Its response avoids the core of liberation theology, which, as Gustavo Guterres emphasizes, requires a preferential option for the poor, for the marginalized, and for the oppressed. By declining to name and challenge the structural injustices of occupation and apartheid specifically, the GNPT's response emerges as a bland, vanilla restatement of international law rather than a call to action rooted in moral and theological convictions. Secondly, the GNPT's professed neutrality in condemning both sides of the conflict is, in effect, a form of complicity. In a statement ostensibly responding to mass civilian casualties and pervasive structural violence, its stance recalls the concept of colonial neutrality, which is a position that historically masks complicity in oppression. By condemning the targeting of civilians by any party and noting the spread of violence across Palestine, a passive construction that obscures the occupying forces' agency, the GNPT's language disregards the stark asymmetry of power and agency. The both sides rhetoric shields the powerful from accountability and subtly reinforces colonial hierarchies. Thirdly, the GNPT's approach reveals a troubling lack of theological engagement with the specific appeals of Palestinian Christians who have called for a reckoning with the theological roots of the occupation. While the Palestinian Christian Open Letter demands a commitment to justice-centered theology, the GNPT's response deflects from this imperative. It offers a cursory statement that they stand against the use of theology to justify oppression, before abruptly and curiously pivoting to an opposition to both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. This so-called balanced denunciation overlooks Palestinian Christians entirely, raising the question, where in this ostensibly equal condemnation do the voices and suffering of Palestinian Christians feature at all? Lastly, the GNPT's reluctance to express clear theological solidarity with Palestinian Christians is its most glaring failure. In their open letter, Palestinian Christians urge the global Christian community to recognize and repent for its complicity in legitimizing oppression. The GNPT's avoidance of these demands, choosing instead a generic call for peace, epitomizes what Martin Luther King Jr. powerfully critiqued as the stance of what he calls the white moderate. He said, and I paraphrase what he said for gendered inclusive language here, the white moderate, I'm quoting, is more devoted to order than to justice. They prefer a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. They constantly say, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action. They paternalistically believe that they can set the timetable for another person's freedom. They live by a mythical concept of time, and they constantly advise the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Unquote. I would argue that the GNPT adopts the white moderate approach that King talks of. Instead of using its platform to affirm the moral and theological necessity of justice, the statement ultimately reflects a theology that values caution over conviction and neutrality over solidarity. In sum, this is neither a true public theology nor a liberative one. It is a theology that maintains the oppressive order rather than dismantling it, demonstrating the profound limitations of a public theology that seeks to appease rather than to liberate. I turn now to my final example of uncritical neutrality and deadly words by Marion Buddy, the Episcopal Bishop of Washington, who became famous or infamous as one who speaks to national conscience when she called out Donald Trump a few weeks ago. Yet on October 11th, 2023, Buddy, through the Episcopal Diocese of Washington, issued a statement on the violence in Israel and Gaza. Let us look at what she and her colleague had to say. The execution of Israelis and others at the hands of Hamas terrorists is abhorrent, and we grieve with everyone in Israel who is suffering from this violent attack. In this moment when Israel endures the largest slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust, we must not be lazy about this truth. This is a moment when we must say, without equivocation, that the senseless targeting of innocent civilians is always and everywhere wrong. The capture and rape of civilian hostages, the slaughter of parents and children, the wanton and unprovoked carnage unleashed against the citizens of Israel is evil, and we must condemn it. This violence grieves the very heart of God, and God weeps for the people of Israel. It is equally true that God's heart breaks for the suffering people of Gaza. The vast and half are children who have known nothing but war. And the majority of Palestinians living in Gaza are not terrorists. Israel's response must protect the innocent. Even as terrorists purposefully target civilians, democracies must yield to the humanitarian mandate to protect the innocent and the most vulnerable. At first glance, Buddy's statement, like the GNPT one, appears to acknowledge suffering on both sides. Yet a closer analysis reveals a stark imbalance in how grief and victimhood are constructed. Her condemnation of Hamas is immediate, it's unambiguous, and it is emotionally charged. She speaks of abhorrent acts, evil, and the largest slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust, using visceral and absolute language. In contrast, when addressing Palestinian suffering, her tone shifts to one of caution and abstraction. The concern for Israel's response is framed not as a condemnation, but as a reminder that it must protect the innocent, subtly positioning Israel as the moral actor rather than the aggressor responsible for mass civilian casualties. The asymmetry deepens in her descriptions of violence. Israeli victims are humanized with explicit details: the capture and rape of civilian hostages, the slaughter of parents and children, while Palestinians are referred to in vague, depersonalized, and passive terms as a suffering people. Nowhere does she name the structural violence of the occupation, the siege, or the apartheid policies that shape Palestinian resistance. Israeli deaths are a massacre. Palestinian deaths are an unfortunate reality. This framing erases the systemic nature of Israel's violence, reducing it to a regrettable necessity rather than an extension of a long-standing colonial project. Buddy's theological language further reinforces this imbalance. God weeps for the people of Israel, she states first, before adding, as an afterthought, that God's heart also breaks for the suffering people of Gaza. While appearing even-handed, this sequencing overwhelmingly prioritizes Israeli grief. By presenting the situation as a tragic but symmetrical conflict, she obscures the vast power asymmetry between an occupying state and an occupied people, between a nuclear-armed military and a besieged population. Her appeal to a universal humanitarian ethic, as she says, some things are true on one side of the border as they are on the other, creates a false equivalence that ignores the fundamental injustices of the occupation. Buddy has been praised for a prophetic courage in confronting Trump, and rightly so, embodying the liberatory impulse of theology that calls for justice against oppression. Yet, her response to Palestine exposes the limits of her liberation theology. A true liberation theology does not selectively apply its moral vision. It recognizes that oppression is global and intersectional. By failing to extend the same critical scrutiny to Israeli state violence as she does to other forms of state power, Buddy's theology remains partial. A genuinely prophetic stance does not merely balance grief, but it interrogates the occupation as the root of the violence. If Buddy's theology is to truly embody liberation, it should have moved beyond selective moral clarity and confront injustice wherever it manifests, not just in Washington, but in Tel Aviv and Gaza as well. So the limitations of Buddy's liberation theology highlight the need for a theology that moves beyond neutrality, one that fully embraces a global Palestinian theology of solidarity. And I now move to the final section of the paper, which you will be relieved to know, and I outline what such a theology can look like and the key principles that such a theology should employ. To do this, I draw on Black intersectional theology, which my colleague Demain Solomons and I name as a theology of resistance, of existence, and solidarity. Given time constraints, I will only briefly demonstrate how each of these constructs apply to our discussion today. A theology of existence, the right to self-determination. As I noted with Demain Solomons, the task of Black liberation theology is not just to critique the racist and socially unjust underpinnings of systems and structures or so-called universal Western theologies. It is also to create theologies that arise proudly from Black existential and cultural experiences and to provide more nuanced conceptions of Blackness. A radical Palestinian theology of solidarity must begin with the affirmation of Palestinian existence, similar to the cry for Black self-determination within Black consciousness discourses. As Palestinian liberation theologians have noted, the very existence of the Palestinian people, their identity, culture, and history are under constant threat from the Israeli occupation. This threat manifests not only in physical violence and displacement, but also in attempts to erase Palestinian history and identity from the land and global consciousness. For Palestinians, the struggle to exist is not only about surviving in a hostile environment, but also about maintaining and reclaiming their identity and history in the face of systematic erasure. The Nakba of 1948 is a central moment in Palestinian history that continues to shape their struggle for existence. Israeli policies such as settlement expansion, home demolitions, and the blockade of Gaza are designed to undermine Palestinian existence on their land. In this context, a global Palestinian theology of solidarity begins by asserting the sacredness of Palestinian existence. A second pillar of global Palestinian theology of solidarity is resistance, both social and epistemic. Here I draw again on intersectional black theology. The origins of black theologies in South Africa lay in the desire of their proponents to speak prophetically and powerfully to state theologies that justified apartheid and to church theologies that wanted to claim some apolitical or neutral stance. Prophetic theology was a theology of resistance against church and state theologies and is foundational to black theology. Similarly, a Palestinian theology of solidarity must embrace a theology of resistance that involves both direct action against the forces of repression and the cultivation of a counter-narrative that challenges the dominant theological and political discourses. This is evident in the various forms of Palestinian resistance, from the armed struggle to nonviolent protests, to cultural preservation and the international boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Each of these forms of resistance reflects a refusal to accept the occupation and assertion of Palestinian agency and resistance. A global liberation theology of solidarity will also align itself with a theology of resistance that draws on the rich biblical tradition of prophetic resistance against unjust rulers and empires. The prophets of the Hebrew Bible, from Amos to Isaiah, spoke out against the oppression of the poor and the marginalized, often at great personal risk. Jesus himself resisted the Roman Empire and the religious authorities of his time, ultimately paying with his life. This is risky business. This tradition of resistance is central to a Palestinian theology of liberation, which sees the struggle against occupation as a continuation of this risky prophetic tradition. This theology also challenges the pacifist interpretations of Christian theology that have often been used to discourage resistance. While nonviolence is an important principle, a theology of resistance recognizes that there are times when resistance must be more direct and confrontational. It does not condone violence for its own sake, but understands that in the face of systemic violence and oppression, resistance is both a moral and a theological necessity. Furthermore, this theology of resistance also involves intellectual and cultural resistance. Palestinian scholars, artists, and activists engage in the production of knowledge and culture that challenges the dominant narratives of the occupiers and reclaims Palestinian history, identity, and dignity. This form of resistance is essential in countering the epistemic violence that seeks to erase Palestinian existence from the global narrative. And a third and final critical pillar of a global theology of solidarity is the recognition that solidarity must be intersectional and it must be self-reflective. True solidarity requires not only an alignment with the oppressed, but also a commitment to examining the internal dynamics of liberation movements to ensure that they do not themselves reproduce the very exclusions and oppressions they seek to dismantle. As Solomons and I argued in our critique of black theology, the struggle against oppression cannot be limited to race. It must also encompass solidarity with other marginalized groups, including women and LGBTQ+ individuals. This critique of black theology's blind spots regarding gender and sexuality offers a vital lens through which to examine a theology of solidarity with Palestine. While Palestinian theology of liberation has rightly focused on the urgent and ongoing injustices of occupation, it has not always fully extended its solidarity to other marginalized groups within its own society. For instance, the Palestinian Kairos document, a landmark theological statement, had only 3 women signatories, reflecting the underrepresentation of women in these discourses. A theology of liberation that does not consider the marginalization of women, queer people, or other vulnerable groups risks perpetuating hierarchies of power and exclusion within its own ranks. Similarly, a Palestinian Christian theology of liberation must also be aware of the colonial legacy of Christianity within which it stands, particularly its potential to impose Christo-normative frameworks that might obscure or marginalize other faith traditions. A theology of solidarity with Palestinians, therefore, must intentionally interrogate its capacity for interfaith solidarity, ensuring that the voices and experiences of Muslims, Jews, and other faiths are not overshadowed. Finally, the decolonial feminist scholarship of scholars like Musa Dube and Kwok Pulan offers essential insights into how liberation theologies must address the multiple intersecting forms of oppression that marginalized groups face. In their critiques of patriarchal and colonial structures, Dube and Kwok show that for women in colonized societies, oppression is not singular, but operates on multiple fronts. Their post-colonial feminist hermeneutics offer important signposts for the tasks of introspective liberation theologies, for what Mercy Odeyoyo has called an eruption within an eruption. The work of liberation is ongoing, and a theology of solidarity must remain vigilant, constantly interrogating its own blind spots and biases. So let me bring this to a close. Liberation theology in its black, feminist, and decolonial forms, I argue, offers a more rigorous and justice-oriented response than mainstream and public theologies that prioritizes compromise over confrontation, that favors false equivalencies over moral clarity, that chooses diplomacy over the pursuit of truth, and this one might hurt a little, that chooses donor funding over moral accountability. A radical Palestinian theology of solidarity grounded in existence, resistance, and global solidarity affirms the sacredness of Palestinian life and the necessity of confronting injustice. Neutrality was never an option in liberation theologies. A theology that refuses to challenge empire becomes a theology that blesses it. And if I haven't been frank enough, let me end by saying this unambiguously. In the aftermath of Gaza, theological neutrality is genocidal complicity. Those who adopted such theologies during the genocide and spoke with forked tongues about conflicts and used an all lives matter rhetoric to mask their theological bigotry have the blood of almost 150,000 Palestinians on their hands. And no amount of whitewashing will change that. The blood of the children from Palestine will cry out. No theological manipulation can silence their voices or cleanse the stain of their complicity. And so I will say it again, theological neutrality is genocidal complicity. Free Palestine.